Good morning, everyone. It is an honor to speak with you all today at the 11th Annual America's Role in the World Conference. My name is Elena Laguna, and I'm a sophomore studying International Studies and East Asian Languages and Cultures, as well as Middle Eastern Languages and Cultures. Over the past 2 years, I have been fortunate to take my studies far beyond the classroom. Last summer, I was awarded the U.S. Department of State Critical Language Scholarship and spent 2 months studying Mandarin in Taiwan, which exposed me to timely cross-strait foreign policy developments and prompted my interest in U.S.-China strategic competition over critical technologies in the Indo-Pacific. I am also a student consultant for HLS Global Development Consulting, where I had the privilege of working with the U.S. mission to ASEAN last semester, a project that furthered my understanding of U.S. foreign policy and growing economic cooperation in this region. Participating in GDC has been one of the most rewarding parts of my college journey, providing opportunities to explore my academic and professional interests while having a real-world impact. As an HLS student ambassador, I always take my tour groups by the photographs of Representative Lee Hamilton and Senator Richard G. Lugar, our school's namesakes and two incredibly influential foreign policy giants throughout their congressional careers. I definitely talk way too fast and excitedly about them on these tours. In fact, I probably talked for 3 minutes straight about Senator Lugar's work during our most recent student ambassador meeting. I would be remiss if I did not attribute my passion for these congressmen to the moderator of this panel, HLS founding dean Lee Feinstein. As an incoming freshman, I had the opportunity to participate in the inaugural DC Global Leadership Forum, now DC Global Policy Program, a series of lectures and site visits with leaders in government and foreign affairs. During each session, Ambassador Feinstein would, without fail, make a connection back to Indiana and to our school's namesakes. And it was inspiring to learn about the history and legacy I have become a part of as a student here. He taught me that Representative Hamilton and Senator Lugar were exemplars of statesmen committed to the national security interests of the United States through cooperation across the aisle, advancing pivotal legislation that paved the path of U.S. foreign policy for their generation. I believe we must now look to their examples of principled and bipartisan leadership as we enter and navigate a new era of American foreign policy in our generation. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce the moderator for this panel, founding dean of the Hamilton Lugar School and current president of McLarty Associates, Ambassador Lee Feinstein.
Very good. As you can see, that Elena's a real slouch. Elena, you've been a real pioneer at the school. As you said, you were the part of the first class of the Hamilton Lugar School's DC Leadership Forum. And what Elena didn't say is she did it, well, you kind of did it even before she was a matriculated student at IU, right after high school graduation. And she was still a star of the class even then. And the other thing to say about Elena is that she has some personal connection to the Lugar family through her high school, one of her high school classmates. It was a relative, and so she had a head start in getting to know about the Hamilton Lugar School. It's so nice to be here. As Elena said, the 11th anniversary. This conference is the academic version of the Little Five. And I'll explain that to our guests later on.
Really excited to see where that's going.
Yeah.
Fast, it's going fast, and I'll give you a hint. Breaking away is the hint. We are really lucky today because we have an opportunity to ask questions that bridge academic theory and high-level diplomatic practice. So take advantage of that opportunity. I know you will. And we will talk a bit about the backgrounds of our guests, but then get their takes on the subject at hand. But let me do some introductions first. Ambassador Thomas Greenfield, it's really a pleasure to have you back again. Of course, Ambassador Thomas Greenfield's been our keynote speaker not simply dropping in, but investing a lot of time with us, meeting with students this morning. Can't say enough about it. That's the kind of engagement that reflects an approach to public service that we associate with the very best policymakers and diplomatic leaders. Thank you again. Born and raised in Louisiana, a proud graduate of LSU and the University of Wisconsin-Madison, kind of okay Midwest University. We're just extremely honored to have you here. Ambassador Thomas Greenfield, and I didn't know this until I dug into the history a little bit, was also an academic before entering into political work, teaching political science at Bucknell before joining the Foreign Service, and then, of course, senior official in the Migration and Refugees Bureau, where she also got to know our previous ambassador on our previous panel, which is lovely, ambassador to Liberia, Director General of the Foreign Service. I will talk a little bit more about that so we can decode that for our group. Assistant Secretary for Africa, and of course, 4 years in New York as the United States Perm Rep to the United Nations. Sorry, Daniel, you've a tough act to follow. Dean Dresner is also no slouch, a deeply respected scholar, a strong and independent voice in academia and policy circles. He represents the very best tradition of speaking truth to power. He's the author of 7 books, I hope I got that correct, including All Politics is Global, and Theories of International Politics and Zombies. And I encourage you, if you haven't already, to read his piece with Elizabeth Saunders, who's a Columbia University political scientist, his and their take on the first year of the Trump administration and foreign affairs. It's a very good piece, and we'll get into some of the issues that Dean Dresner addresses there. I like in my classes to flag reference points, reference materials, good institutions to look at, and people to consult if you're just looking for benchmarks on how to follow and understand what's happening in the world. Dean Dresner is one of those people, and if you aren't familiar with it, check out his Substack, Dresner's World. It's terrific. A native of Syracuse, for the purposes of this conference, we're going to call that the Heartland, and I think it's true. Graduate of Williams College, master's and PhD from Stanford, and stints at the State Department and think tanks from RAND to the Council on Foreign Relations. And he is academic dean and distinguished professor of international politics at the Fletcher School. I have a warning for upper level students, and I appreciate Dean Dresner giving me that warning, that he will try to recruit you to the Fletcher School. And I will just, for the advanced degree, I will just simply note, I'm going to call you Dan now, that we have a joint degree with the top public affairs school in the country, so I just wish you good luck with that, and that we're watching you. So round one, we'll call What Made You Do It? And it's an opportunity to look at 2 career paths, I think either of which could have gone in the other direction, to sort of get a sense of what, and sometimes it's not one thing, and sometimes it happens as it happens, to understand the career trajectory of our guests today. So, Ambassador Thomas Greenfield, if I can start with you. When you look back, was there a moment in your early years, in your formative years, that made you think you grew up in Louisiana, that you began to think about foreign policy and how the United States represented itself in the world?
I have to admit that it's only recently that I look back on my life and remembered that there was a moment, because I used to tell everyone I never thought about working in the foreign affairs community. But when I was in 8th grade, we had the good fortune of having the United States make a decision to send Peace Corps volunteers to my little bitty hometown in my little bitty community called Leland. And there was a college there, HBCU, that had closed down. It was a Christian Baptist college, Leland College. And I went there first grade and second grade. And then the college closed down. And the buildings, the facility was empty. And suddenly, out of the blue, about 30 Peace Corps volunteers showed up with about a half dozen Africans from Swaziland and Somalia to train for their Peace Corps assignments in those two countries. And they treated our little community, because it was a little poor rural community, they treated us like we were part of their project. And they invited the community, children, to come and learn the languages with them. And so I volunteered. And every day after school, I'd go over, and I was being taught Siswati. Now, I have to tell you, I don't remember a word now. But I remembered the Siswati teacher, Glory Mamba. And lo and behold, I go to the University of Wisconsin. Now, remember, I was in 8th grade, so 4 more years of high school, 4 more years of college, so 8 years. I show up at the University of Wisconsin. There was some program, I can't remember. It was an audience like this, and there was this lady, and everybody is saying, "Glory, glory." And I thought, wow, the only person I ever knew with that name was Glory Mamba. So I go over to her, and I say, "Glory, were you in Louisiana teaching Siswati?" And she said, "Yes." I said, "I'm Linda Thomas." And she knew me because my family had embraced her. And Glory and I became very, very close friends. So I do believe that was the moment. I went to Wisconsin to get a master's in public administration. I had no intention of working on a PhD. I didn't know anything about Africa at all. And I met this professor, Crawford Young. And anybody who's in African studies know Crawford Young. He passed away a couple of years ago. And Crawford embraced me. And so I changed my mind about finishing this master's degree, going back to Louisiana, applying to LSU for law school, and the rest would have been history. I changed my mind. And I decided I was going to go into academics, and I started working on a PhD. I did 2 solid years of really intense study and classes, and then I would go to Liberia in 1978 to do research. And I would meet the man that I had been married to for 43 years on April 24th. He was working in the embassy. I never thought about the Foreign Service, but I got to house sit for him. And then once we kind of, many years later, probably 3 years later, when we were thinking this might be permanent, I'm like, what kind of job can I have that would allow us to work together? And I'd taken the Foreign Service exam in 1978. I took the oral exam in 1980. It took a long time back then. And I passed all of these exams. My plan had been, I'm going to do academics, but if I fail, I'll go to Peace Corps. Peace Corps was always my plan B, which is why I really promote Peace Corps for young people's plan A now, because I wish I'd done it. But that door opened, and I came into the Foreign Service in 1982. I love to tell everybody that Bill Burns, the Deputy Secretary of State, ambassador to Russia, ambassador to Jordan, and then CIA director and a member of the President's cabinet, Bill and I were in the same Foreign Service class.
Amazing.
But that's my history.
That's a pretty amazing A100 class.
Yeah.
Can I stay with you a little bit, just to take it a little bit further, and then Dean Dresner, I'm going to ask you some of the same kinds of questions. When you were teaching at Bucknell, was there something that happened that said, okay, you know, I like being an academic. Of course, you love being with students. We know that, but really made you choose a life as a a Foreign Service
So I
officer.
really deeply wanted to be an academic, and I had amazing students at Bucknell, but I was also a little disappointed in my students because all they cared about were grades. That was my view. They wanted a grade. I would constantly fight with students over whether they got an A- or a B+. And it was just, how do I go through this all the time? Let me make my own decisions. But the worst decision was I failed a football player who was the star player.
Just be careful.
I
Be
know.
careful. You know.
Star player on Bucknell's team. So I get this call from the coach. Will you reconsider? I'm like, sure. I've never met him. He's never come to my class. So maybe if he comes to see me and we have a little conversation, I might be able to change the grade to a D-. I mean, literally, that's how bad it was. Student didn't care because he was a star football player. He didn't tell the coach that there were a number of times, we were a small campus, and I knew where he lived. I knew his dormitory. I used to push notes. We didn't have computers, right? We didn't have email. We didn't have cell phone. I would push a little note on his door. Please come and see me. Never. So I refused to change the student's grade, which meant he was out of the school. He was gone. So I got a call from the head of the Alumni Association. We need you to relook at this. And I'm like, I've already had a conversation. In the meantime, I was already going through the process of going into the Foreign Service. And then when I got the third call from the president of the university, I'm like, I'm through with this. This guy is failing, and I am not going to change his grade. And if you guys are going to fire me, I stand on principle. He never came to my class. He never took a test. He didn't care about his grade. He earned this F. He didn't earn a D. He didn't even earn a D-. He earned an F, and I'm sticking with it. And the guy was off the football team for a semester. And I thought, do I really want to do academics and have to go through this crap all the time, fighting with students over grades and having the administration call me over grades? Thank God I had this option of going into the Foreign Service. Get out of here. But I came back because I taught at Georgetown for 3 years.
Yes, that's wonderful. I'm so glad we learned that story. And Dean Dresser, I know there's no football team at Fletcher, so you haven't had to confront this.
We have a serious a cappella program, though. I'm just kidding.
We'll get to you.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask about a career path within the State Department, if I may. Preparing for this, I was told by a colleague in common that when you were Director General, you had been offered what some people might have considered a promotion, or not a promotion, but at least a very plum position as Assistant Secretary of State for Africa. A dream job for somebody with your area interests and expertise, but that you didn't want to give up the DG role. If this is wrong, please tell me.
No,
but can you? Well, I'm glad my research worked out. Would you be kind enough just to explain first to our colleagues here, what the DG job is, and then what it was about it and is about it that you thought was so important?
The Director General of the Foreign Service and the Director of Personnel is a position it's a career position confirmed by the Senate, but it is responsible for the recruiting, the training, the retention, the firing of Foreign Service officers and civil servants. So I had both of those under my bailiwick. But what I loved about the job is that it gave me an opportunity to work with people, to work with the Foreign Service, to ensure that we had a Foreign Service that was representative of America, representative of our values, and well-trained and ready to go out and fly the American flag all over the world. And I got to see them. And I travel to universities. I call myself the chief recruiter, which is not something the director general, there's a whole recruitment office that does all of that, but I work with all of my offices, and I wanted to be the chief recruiter. So I would go out to universities. I went to LSU a lot. I went to Wisconsin. I don't think I came here to do recruiting. I went to Purdue. But I really, really wanted to make sure we got the best and the brightest. And so I loved that job. I was asked to take that job by Secretary Clinton. I didn't think I was the right person for the job because I was a regionalist. I didn't know anything about management. And so I told her, I'm like, I'm not a management person. I don't think this is the right job. And my colleagues in the room will know Pat Kennedy, who was the Undersecretary for Management. And Pat called me and he says, you know, you don't say no to the secretary. And I would have been working for him. So when he called, I thought, okay, this is the right job. If Pat thinks I'm ready for this job, then I'll take it. I'd been in the job for a year. I was on a roll. I was going to change the world. I was going to make the Foreign Service into something that people would really love. That first year I was there, we won the government-wide best places to work in the government. And when I knew we were competing for that, I worked for it and we won it. So I'm on a roll. Secretary Clinton leaves and Secretary Kerry comes on board. And so I get called to brief him in the transition office early. I got my briefing book this big. I got one for him. And I'm like, I'm going to go in there and let him know that I am the person to remain his Director General of the Foreign Service. So I'm sitting there with him, and I start my spiel. I got through 30 seconds of it, and he says, I want to throw a curveball at you. You want a curveball? I'm like, no, sir. He says, I'm going to do it anyway. I want you to be the Assistant Secretary for Africa. And I said, thank you very much, but I'm your Director General of the Foreign Service, and that's where I want to stay. And like every leader, and I learned this from him, don't take no for an answer. Just think about it for a couple of weeks. I'm like, I don't have to think about it. No, think about it for a couple of weeks. So I thought about it for 2 weeks. I called him at the end of 2 weeks. He wouldn't take my phone call. And I kept calling, and he wouldn't take my phone call. John Feiner, who was supposed to be here with us today, was one of his deputy chief of staff. I called John. I'm like, John, I need to talk to the secretary. Yeah. They all knew. Don't let her talk to the secretary. So I finally get a call through to him, and I said, Mr. Secretary, I'm so honored that you considered me for this prestigious position, but I really have given this a lot of thought. You need me as your Director General of the Foreign Service. And he said, well, think about it. And I said, sir, I'm not going to think about it anymore. I'm your Director General of the Foreign Service. So the call was over. My staff was all standing around thinking that he was going to convince me, and he didn't. So this started in January. Maybe I got that second call to him in March. And then I go on a recruiting trip to Georgia. I did 9 universities, and I was driving from Atlanta to Athens, University of Georgia. And my secretary calls and she's like, the secretary wants to speak to you. And we had a bad connection because we were in the countryside. And I said, can he talk to my deputy? I'm sure he wants some more names, because in the meantime, we were giving him names for people for various positions. And Hans can do that. And they're like, I offered him Hans. He didn't want to talk to Hans. I'm like, oh, okay. Tell him I'm going to get to the hotel at 1. I'll call his office as soon as I get to the hotel. And I called him up, and here's what he said to me. Linda, I've spoken to the president. He has given me names of people he wants for this job, and none of them were satisfactory to me. I have given him other names, including yours, that I want for the job. And the only person we both agree on is you. So I became
Wow.
assistant secretary. on the 13th of August, 2013. I will never forget it. I worked in the DG's office until 5, signing all kinds of things. And then I roll my chair that I got when I was in PRM. I roll my chair down the hall, same hallway, went into the Africa Bureau. I was sworn in, given papers to sign. So if anybody ever looks, they're going to see I was DG in the morning, and I was assistant secretary that evening. And I loved the job as assistant secretary.
That's an amazing story, and it clearly took a president and a secretary of state to twist your arm. So that's something. Well, Dean Dresner, Dan, if we talked a little bit about this earlier, early, in formative years, when do you think you caught the foreign policy bug, or the professorial bug?
I'll answer that question, but I want to start by saying, first of all, thanks to the Hamilton Luger School for inviting me out here. And I want to follow up on something that one of the student speakers said yesterday. Nia Thornton, I think, she was a graduate student, who talked about the difficulty of being the only African-American woman sometimes in rooms and feeling like you have a sense of imposter syndrome. And I want, if she's not here, someone tell her this, because this is a very important thing to realize. The imposter syndrome never goes away. It does not matter how old you are. I'm sitting next to Linda Thomas Greenfield. Let me assure you that my imposter syndrome is set at 10 at this point. Okay? So the idea that like at some point you're going to feel better, yeah, you get to hide it a little bit better, to be clear, but it does not go away. You just have to learn to live with it and push on. So that's my advice to all of the students. Also, come to Fletcher.
Hold on. That's amazing. That's amazing advice. Dan, that's amazing advice.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, it really is. It's really true.
The come to Fletcher was amazing too.
Remember, he just endorsed coming to Fletcher.
Yeah,
Apply to the Fletcher School. You heard it from him.
I didn't hear that part.
Now, to answer your question, I'm sorry. I would say there are two moments that sort of stand out. The first was when I was a college junior and I had spent a semester in London. I was studying at Queen Mary in Westfields College, and I did the thing with my girlfriend at the time, got a Eurail pass, traveled all around. And this is going to date me, but this was still when the Cold War was going on. And so we, among other things, went to Prague and Czechoslovakia and then decided we wanted to go to Berlin. And we get to East Berlin, and then as it turns out, we walked to Checkpoint Charlie thinking that way we could cross over. As it turns out, you weren't allowed to do that if you had just had a transit visa, so we had to walk all the way back and then had to go through the process, and we were at a train station called Friedrichstrasse. Now, Friedrichstrasse at the time, when the Berlin subway system was built, the U-Bahn system was built, it accommodated the entire city. Obviously, once the Berlin Wall was set up, the two subway systems were essentially delinked, except at Friedrichstrasse. Friedrichstrasse was the one point that you could cross over. And so after I got through all the processing and I was basically waiting at the train station to board the train that would take me to West Berlin, I realized that the people waiting on the opposite side of the track, probably like 20 feet away from me, they were all East Germans. They were waiting to get on the subway to go to wherever they were. So everyone thinks about trying to, climb the Berlin Wall as a way of trying to escape to West Berlin. The other way you could have done it was by crossing those train tracks and hopping on a train that would take you into West Berlin. So as you can imagine, there were East German guards lining both sides, of the subway system. And I was just looking across, and again, I can see everyone's face. I'm only about maybe 20 yards away from them. And it just struck me that because of international relations, the people on that other side of the train tracks were leading an extremely different life from mine. And that was sort of the moment where I realized the sort of the human effects of a lot of what goes on in the world. And I think that was probably the moment where I thought maybe I want to study this a little more. And then you asked about also about being a professor. There's a lot of different things that go into that, but one experience I had was that when I was a third-year graduate student at Stanford, I spent a year teaching economics in Donetsk, Ukraine. This is in the mid-90s. It was with a program called Civic Education Project. And it was a very interesting time to be there, as you can imagine. And I'm teaching in English. And I'm trying to teach economics to students who were in what was the English department there, basically, because they could understand the English. And I just remember this one student who was trying really hard to understand me, and was putting in the effort, but not necessarily getting the comprehension. And we all have had students like that, where they're really trying to put in the work, but it can be difficult. And I'm teaching economics, and I had made one point, and I was going to another point that I was going to connect to the first point. And I'm watching this student as I'm teaching this, and I'm arriving at the sort of connection. And about a second before I got there, she suddenly went, like she had this epiphany of where I was going. And that is a high that is better than any narcotic can get you. And I realized at that moment that as much as I might want to have policy influence, as much as I might have wanted to serve in government, that was the high I wanted to pursue.
That's a beautiful story. Can you say a little bit about, I mean, you've been in the government, you've had a serious government career in addition to your academic career. But as you were considering keeping your options open, I recall you telling me about some advice you got from one of your
Yes. So when I was at Stanford, I was there during the same time that Condi Rice was in between her two stints in government. She had just worked at the NSC under George H.W. Bush, and this was before she became National Security Advisor under Bush, actually before she became provost of the university. And Condi's advice to me, because she knew that I had potentially policy aspirations, was that I had to sort of think about my career as a decision tree. And and this is true, and this has changed, I would also point out, but at the time, the idea was if you, God forbid, were an academic who had any interest whatsoever in pursuing policy or having real-world implications for what you did, you keep that under your skirt. You do not talk about that until you get tenure. That, God forbid, if you publish an op-ed or anything like that, that would somehow sully you. And so her advice was stay, on the academic track. Once you have tenure, you can potentially do whatever you want. Now, I listened mostly to what she said, but I actually did do a Council on Foreign Relations International Affairs Fellowship, and that was when I was actually at Treasury and not State. But that was also a very informative year, and it confirmed that I'd made the right decision to stay being a professor. I really enjoyed the policy experience. It was fantastic. I was there during a time when we were ramping up the anti-money laundering operations, which wound up being extremely helpful post 9/11. But I still remember a DAS a Deputy Assistant Secretary that was my immediate superior, and we were talking about a whole variety of things that we had to get done. And at one point, he just sort of sighed and looked at me, and he said, 90% of my job is process. And he's right. He was absolutely right. And that is, by the way, not an insignificant thing. You have to get the process right. But I confess I was also interested in the substance. And so, I was actually a really effective bureaucrat for that year, I think. But I think the reason I was an effective bureaucrat was because I didn't care about the relationships I had to make, because I was leaving. I had an exit option. If these were people that I had to maintain relationships for a decade plus, I would have probably behaved very differently. I would have probably behaved in a much more risk-averse manner. And so that was also a cautionary tale for me, which is I like policymaking. I can play with others, but I think I do have the academic mindset of let me write what I want to write.
Well, also spoken like a true political scientist in terms of your incentive structure and how you behaved in the environment in which you found yourself, which is a good transition to round two, which I'm calling Help Wanted. And here it's to the topic of this panel, which is foreign policy in a new age. And as we wrote in the description in the program, every year we do this conference, we say, these are historic times. And those who are veterans of the conference know that it's been true every year also. And every year, the other thing we say is, and it's never been truer than this year. And that's also true this year. Although things seem to have sped up, and every week it seems like we're in a kind of a different, if not a different era, a different period. So for the benefit of all of us, students and others in the room, I'm hoping we can get a way to grasp and kind of understand where we are, to sort of put it in some kind of an analytical or historical context that can give us a way to sort of think and understand better. So I might start, Dean Dresner, with you on this question. Can you give us some frameworks to understand and evaluate the period we're in? What's the period we left? If you think we've left a period, is it a rupture and that's temporary, as the Prime Minister of Canada said famously in Davos? Is it even new? The title of this is foreign policy. Is it even new, or is it a return to something else? Give us your best thoughts.
Okay, so first we should talk about what we've left, because that's the important thing. If you're talking about there's a change, what are we changing from? And there's a term that everyone likes to talk about, either the rules-based international order or the liberal international order, which honestly was not a term that really was even talked about until about 20 years ago. But was it a thing? Absolutely. And I think actually the previous panels sort of touched on this a little bit, which is the idea of this was the United States as the hegemon had a certain set of policy interests, one generally based on the idea that we want to avoid what happened in the run-up to World War II, so we want to make sure that we have a, relatively speaking, open global economy, that we have some set of rules of the game and multilateral structures that, even if they don't work all the time, are at least places where, actors with different preferences can meet, and even if there's conflict, the conflict will hopefully not escalate too much. And particularly after the Cold War ended, the US saw this as an opportunity to basically take all of the rules that had been originally set up just to operate within the Western Bloc and expand that and globalize them. And that's really what happened. The institutions like the World Trade or the GATT, then the World Trade Organization, the Bretton Woods institutions like the IMF and the World Bank, a whole panoply of structures. The ones that had suffered from dysfunction during the Cold War, like the United Nations, suddenly started doing a few more things. But a lot of those other institutions that were set up just to Western management became much more inclusive. And the deal with those institutions, and the deal with the general liberal international order, was that by and large the system would run operating according to US preferences. But at the same time, the US also agreed that it would most of the time be bound by those rules. The idea of self-binding, John Eikenberry, who's a colleague, talked about this. The idea that, for this to be a good deal for everyone, the US would get the sort of policy preferences that it wanted, but in turn, it also had to at least somewhat adhere to those rules so that everyone else understood that that was how the social contract functioned. Now, why have we departed from that? Because we've clearly departed from that. There's a couple of things going on. One is there's been a shift in the distribution of power. The U.S. is no longer, the unmatched superpower that it was at the dawn of this century. And so there are other countries that have different preferences, and they might want to run things a little bit differently. The other thing that's going on, though, is was sort of a domestic, not uprising, but a domestic reaction to the rules-based international order, and this sort of populist surge that argued that the rules that the U.S. set out hollowed out somehow, the U.S., the American dream, and that countries like China somehow gamed the system to rise to where they were. Now, like all stylized facts, there is a grain of truth to those things. It's not entirely true, but there's no denying that is part of what's going on. And that led, a lot of folks, and then add on top of that a whole series of shocks from the 2008 financial crisis onward, including COVID, including Russia's invasion of Ukraine, including the war in Gaza, to a belief that the rules had become a hypocritical system, that they were being honored in name only. And so, you have with the second Trump administration, there's a quote that I always think about from The Sun Also Rises, I think, from Ernest Hemingway, where one character asks another, how did you go bankrupt? And the character answers two ways. First, slowly, and then suddenly, or some variation to that effect. And you argue we've had this sort of slow erosion of the liberal international order for well over a decade now. We're in the sudden phase. Because we now have an administration that honestly doesn't care about whether or not it's adhering to international law. Indeed, does not respect international law. I think the most blunt statement of this was Steve Miller's statement. I think it was on Jake Tapper's show, where he said, let's just be honest, we live in a world operated by force, operated by power. And that's the way things go. And as someone who's had to teach Thucydides almost every year, I know the Melian dialogue when I hear it being quoted or being paraphrased. And that's essentially what the Athenians were saying, at the Melian dialogue, in which they said, look, you should surrender, and if you don't, we'll kill you, and that's just the way the world works. Mm-hmm. Of course, what I would have loved Miller to have known was what happens after the Melian dialogue, which is Athens, fueled by hubris, then decides, let's invade Sicily, and we'll see how that works out. Spoiler alert for those of you who haven't read the book, it works out horribly for them. Okay. But the point being that I think the administration decided that they don't like the way the current system works and are basically exercising the exit option of we are going to try to create a new world. And there are contours of what you can sort of see of a world where I would actually use the word Hobbesian to describe it. But that has two meanings in this instance. And I'll close there because I know I've been rambling. First, Hobbesian, everyone knows, Hobbes thought of the state of nature as a war of all against all, in which life was nasty, brutish, and short. And if you listen to Trump talk about international relations, that is how he thinks about it. It's that this truly anarchical world, but anarchical in the sense of chaos, not just in the sense of the absence of world government. And so therefore, the U.S. just has to do what it, it's the law of the jungle, and the U.S. should do what it does in order to advance, national interest. And he sees, and his administration sees China and Russia and others doing the same. And if anything, they get offended when other countries even suggest maybe there should be larger, higher principles in this. I think that's one of the reasons why the U.S., this administration doesn't like Europe in the slightest, because God forbid you actually think about things like humanitarian norms or things like that. But the other way it's a Hobbesian system is that when Hobbes wrote Leviathan, he made 2 points. He talked about the fact that it's a war of all against all, and therefore everyone needs to sort of band together in a social contract to guard against that. But if you ever read what Hobbes thought about the way a domestic state should be organized, Hobbes was violently opposed to any kind of countervailing power to the Leviathan. He thought that any kind of domestic, actor that could even be a check on the Leviathan was dangerous. And remember, he's writing during the English Civil War. And I think that is also where Trump believes in a Hobbesian order. He wants a domestic system in which there is no impediment to what he does, not just internationally, but also domestically. And I think what we've seen in the first year and change of his second term is exactly how that's played out.
Couldn't agree more.
Did you want to?
No, unless you want me to.
Go, please, absolutely.
She agreed with me. I just want that for
I
the record.
did.
My
I
imposter
agree with
syndrome
her.
is doing real well right now. So sorry, go ahead.
But, you asked about the changes that we've seen. And I'll start with the beginning of the Biden administration. So when the Biden administration came in 2021, we had this mantra: diplomacy is back. Multilateralism is back. U.S. leadership is back. We're ready to continue our place in the world where we are the leader. And we've seen all these efforts to change the rules of the road, to move us away from a rules-based society. We want that back. And I would say here, we didn't succeed in bringing it back, because the first question we were asked when we came back is it forever? Mm-hmm. Can we trust you? Can we have confidence in you, America, not you, the Biden administration, but you, America, that you are truly back and we will never go through what we went through during the first Trump administration, which when we look back on it, wasn't so bad when we look at what they're doing now. And so we couldn't answer that question. I couldn't answer it when I was being asked, and I never heard anyone else in the administration truly give an answer to that question, because we truly didn't know. And then we get the Trump administration. They learned lots of lessons from their failures in the first administration. Like, we're not going to nibble around the edges of the foundation. We're not going to play around with these people. We're going to throw a grenade in the room and get this stuff over with immediately. And Jesus, in 1 month, it had turned around. And the world was questioning our commitments to a rules-based society. They were questioning our leadership. They were questioning our values. Until today, they are. So we find ourselves in a totally different world where we're fighting to maintain democracy at home. And we don't know how to do it. We know how to do it elsewhere because we can go into Africa and say, thou shalt not. And if thou shalt, we'll cut off our aid. And countries bend to that sometimes. But suddenly, who do we say thou shalt not to in the United States when we see our democracy beginning to falter? You know, how do we deal with a system that is not based on the balance of power, but where power is concentrated in the presidency and nobody is saying anything? And then on the other side, the world is looking at us. Canada's speech speaks to that and saying, we can't depend on these guys anymore. They were our godfather, and now they're not here. And we as kind of middle powers have to find another godfather to lean on. So going to China, shocking, right? They're looking at China as the good guys. We're not the good guys anymore. We're flexing our muscles. We're being bullies. We stand up at the United Nations in front of everyone and say, you're a bunch of feckless people. You don't know what you're doing, and we're going to tell you how to do it. And so we're in this state, and this is historical. I think we're in this state where now we have to figure out who we are as American people, not even considering the government, who we are and how we relate to the rest of the world. We were proud to wave the Statue of Liberty, you know, bring me your huddled masses. Now we're sending your huddled masses back home. We don't want them and tell them not to come. So there are a lot of people, even I think people who were strong Trump voters, who are saying, is this actually what we want? But we can't turn it around. And I think I heard someone say on the other panel, we got 2.5 more years. And it doesn't matter what happens at the polls in November. Because this president has shown that he will do what he wants to do regardless of what he's told to do. He will do what he wants to do regardless of what the Constitution says. The judges are feckless. I'm going to go into the Supreme Court. And imagine how intimidating it had to be to have the President of the United States sitting there. It's never been done before. So it'll be interesting to see what the court does. I still have confidence in our institutions. I have confidence that the courts will do the right thing. They haven't always. Deciding that the president is all-powerful and cannot be held accountable for any actions he takes as president is scary. Because I heard that in Africa. I heard it from Charles Taylor. As president, you can't hold me accountable. And we held him accountable. So what the United States does is going to be watched by everyone.
Both of your comments have brought to mind an analogy I hadn't really thought of before. But you mentioned institutions, and I want to ask about, in light of how you're describing the situation, you know, it's a question that also came up in the UN panel about whether we can go back or what's next. But the analogy I wanted to make was, you know, in this period that was described as sort of the period, Brett, I think you described it, of when the UN was effective. It overlapped with a lot of different things, including a period of time when the number of democracies worldwide were growing, and now there's a democratic recession in double-digit years. And it went against a political science theory, with apologies to our political scientists, which was consolidated democracies did not go backwards. Once a democracy was consolidated, they continued to move forward. And I think there's a kind of an analogy with how we thought about the rules-based international system, if we can use that phrase. And you know, that's the future, and that's what we've had for a long time. It's a consolidated system, and it's going to last. So I guess my question is, since we've seen it tested the way it is, what does that mean for different institutions and next steps? So Ambassador Thomas Greenfield, if I can start with you, and a little bit to reprise our last conversation. What does this mean for the UN, and how do you see, if there is an opportunity to reform the UN in a kind of a meaningful and structural way, given the changes which are not just a passing phase?
We can't go back. I hear from people all the time, when there's a Democratic administration, we're going to go back. We can't go back. We went back after Trump won because he only nibbled around the edges of our institutions. A grenade was thrown into USAID. There is no USAID. It is not something that we can build back better. What we'll have to do is take a strategic approach to what we need. And I think if the Trump administration had done that instead of blowing up USAID, they would have been applauded. Look at the institutions we have, what was good about them, what wasn't so good, and let's figure out what we want to be in the future, who we want to be, what role we want to play in the future. We're forced in a position now to question who we are. And I think the answer is not going to be what we were before. It's going to be a new face of the United States. I hope it's a friendly face. I hope it's a kind face. But it's going to be a new face of the world. When you look at the UN, and I love the conversation you all had on the UN, and I was upset that I wasn't sitting up there with you. We do need UN reform. It's been 80 years. The institution that we started 80 years ago is dealing with a world that is totally different from 80 years ago. So I do support expansion of the Security Council, and we actually put out a proposal, and Biden went into the Security Council and even went further than, as presidents are allowed to do, he went further than we had than we had defined we wanted to be, because he opened up the possibility of expanding to the Pacific Islands and other places. And I do think we need to give a voice to smaller countries. Now, I'll be honest about one thing. When we talked about expanding to new members from Africa in the Security Council, I know Africa well enough to know that no agreement would ever be made on who those two people would be. Egypt jumped in quickly. I always told the Egyptians they were only Africans when it suited them. Then you're in the Arab world, so you're not included in this. They didn't like that. And other countries thought, South Africa, Nigeria, it's a given. Well, that's not what everybody else thought. So I finally said, let's pick a little country like Gambia or Guinea-Bissau and make them the two permanent members of the council. Of course, they thought I was crazy, and I was. But for what we were told by the Africans is, well, actually, what we think is the AU should be there. And I'm like, that's a non-starter. AU is not a country. Then I'll have the EU wanting to be there. You're going to have to come to a decision about who you want to represent you. And they're going to have permanent seats. And I'm like, no. We think 10 years, and then we swap. I'm like, what's permanent about 10 years? And we want the veto power. And of course, our position was, we're not going to expand the veto power. So I said to them, you believe, you've said it to me, that the veto power is dysfunctional, that it's hurting how the UN functions. Why would you want 15 countries to have the veto power? Then we won't do anything at all. So the other thing, and this was not a US government position, this is Linda thinking, how do you make this work? So when our Congress vetoes, when our president vetoes something the Congress does, then it can go back to the Congress and 2/3 of the Congress can overturn the president's veto. So my idea was, let's put that in. So yes, the US vetoes, Russia vetoes, China vetoes, and then it goes back to 2/3 of the council or 2/3 of the General Assembly, whatever you want, and see if it can be overturned. And the reason I felt that is because I know that you got to work the crowd. We got 143 votes on Ukraine. Guess why? We worked the room. And Russia and China might pass out envelopes that people might take. We don't pass out envelopes, we pass out influence. And the fact that we would come in the room and walk the room and say, Cameroon, did you get your instructions from your country? Because I already know what their country's instructions are. And the ambassador who, and I shouldn't have used Cameroon as an example, this is not true, but the ambassador who's already taken his envelope says, well, you know, I haven't gotten instructions. And I called his foreign minister and I said, your ambassador says he has not gotten instructions. And the ambassador at that point knows he's under the gun, he has to vote. So having that kind of influence, so I always felt, okay, we can do this veto on probably 60% of the things that we do, we can get 2/3 of countries to support us and not overturn the veto. We're not going to get it every time. I was very confident about that. So that's why I thought that that was something that might be sellable if we reform the Security Council, did not expand the veto, but provided an opportunity for countries, either on the Security Council or in the General Assembly, to overturn a veto by a number of votes. So that's one option I think we ought to look at. That was not a U.S. government position. That was Linda thinking out of the box.
We appreciate that. We're going to begin to take questions soon, so get your questions ready. Dan, in terms of some of the traditional foreign policy tools that we have used, sometimes effectively, sometimes less effectively, and you've had some views about that. Can you, in the new world, maybe in light of what we've seen since the start of the Iran war and the ceasefire,
you got to put the ceasefire in quotes, but keep going.
Ceasefire. Can you give us your riff on sanctions? And then you also talked about, what is it, weaponization?
Weaponized interdependence.
Interdependence,
yes.
yes.
So weaponized interdependence is this notion that, and I think this is actually something else to bear in mind about the open economic order, which was, 25 years ago, you had folks like Tom Friedman arguing, globalization is, great. It means that the world is going to be run by a network. And if it's run by a network, and that flattens everything. Networks are not like hierarchies. Networks are, like the internet. And one of the original creators of the internet, John Perry Barlow, once said that, states can't censor the internet because if the internet interprets censorship as damage and just roots around it. And so at the time, the network metaphor notion was, it's great. It means that we'll be an interconnected world and there's no way anyone can stop it. And as it turns out, Tom Friedman was wrong. Because in a lot of areas of the global economy, it is a network structure. But it turns out that there are also network structures where central nodes of that network become increasingly important, and you can't escape from that node. And so one of the things the United States discovered, particularly post 9/11 with the passage of the USA Patriot Act, is that the dollar was one of those central nodes. And US capital markets were one of those central nodes. And that if the US could basically tell other actors, you don't get to bank with us, you don't get to exchange, even with another bank, if it's denominated in dollars, because we're going to exercise our control, that's a pretty powerful lever. It's one of the things that got Iran to the bargaining table with the JCPOA. It's one of the things that even got North Korea back to the bargaining table back in the mid-2000s. So that's an example where weaponized interdependence, is a situation where in a globalized world economy, controlling a central node is power, it's leverage. The problem, though, is twofold. First, the US, realizing this weapon, started exercising and they started jacking up what they were demanding. And as someone who writes about economic statecraft, you can sometimes use economic coercion to get concrete concessions. But if you ask for the moon, you're not going to get it. And what happened was is that the sort of scale of what the US demanded started going up significantly. The second thing, and this is unfortunately typical American hubris, is that it didn't occur to the United States that there might be other countries that have choke points or could control choke points. So this has been on evident display in the first year of the second Trump administration when the Liberation Day tariffs were passed. And let's all remember the one-year anniversary of that because it's a really significant moment. Were imposed on a whole variety of countries. China retaliated by saying, that's fine, we'll raise tariffs as well. And by the way, you don't get any rare earths anymore or any magnets. And Trump backed down very, very quickly. And is still trying to make sure that there are good relations with China because he recognized that China also had a choke point that they could control. And as we are seeing right now with the Iran conflict, it did not occur to the Trump administration that Iran, even in a weakened state, might control the Strait of Hormuz as a choke point. And that's what we're dealing with now. But I want to close on one other point with this, which is this also represents an institutional problem in the United States. Part of the way the US gets what it wants is its ability to credibly commit. And this, by the way, applies not just to inducements or multilateral institutions. It also applies to coercion. If you're engaging in coercive bargaining, you have to engage in two credible commitments. The first credible commitment is, if you don't do what we want, we will impose sanctions. But the second credible commitment is, if you do what we want, we will lift the sanctions and not reimpose them. And what has happened over time is that as Congress's role, and I hate to say this at the Hamilton Lugar School, because this is about two members of Congress that actually cared about this, Congress's role in foreign policy is atrophied to the point where the US ability to credibly commit has gone. It is basically due to presidential whim. It is up to whatever the president wants to do, whether it's Trump or Obama or Biden or what have you. And in that kind of world, credibly committing that I will lift sanctions if you agree to some acquiescence, are you going to trust Donald Trump to stick to a deal? I'm not. And that's a real issue. And this, by the way, is partly a problem of the Trump administration, but it is mostly a problem of the United States Congress.
All right, let's open the floor to questions, and I think we'll have an opportunity to go back to this idea of foreign policy begins at home, which I think is, to your point, in the Article 1 powers that have not been exercised. So, yes, please stand up. Tell us your major and your question.
First, I would just like to thank you both for just offering your experience to us. I'm Kelly Branson. I'm a senior here at HLS studying international studies with minors in Southeast Asian studies and sociology. So my question is more geared towards Ambassador Greenfield, but please, Professor Dressner, if you also have some techniques on this, please jump in as well. So I'm just wondering how you go about, or what tools you use to negotiate with people who have different expectations or different norms and cultures than you do. So like cross-cultural communication and addressing these things with nuance. I'm just wondering what tools you use to do this.
I always, when I'm meeting someone and I know that I'm negotiating, I try to find out as much about that person as I can before I go into the room. And as I said yesterday, my first tool is always respect and kindness. Even if we are enemies, when I walk in the room, I'm going to walk in the room with a smile. Now, sometimes if there's a camera, I don't want the camera seeing me smile, but I will walk in the room with a smile. My way of saying, I respect you. Not that I like you, but I respect you. And I'll share with you a negotiation, not when I was UN ambassador, when I was the refugee coordinator in Pakistan. And I went to meet with the Taliban. No Americans were meeting with the Taliban. The Taliban came in November of 1996. And I went to a meeting with the Minister of Health, who had made an edict that women doctors could not work, and women could not see male doctors. And So I went into the room. I had a scarf on, out of respect for the culture. And when I walked in the room, he said to me, "You Americans are trying to impose your culture on us." And I immediately took the scarf off. And I said, "I wore this scarf out of respect for your culture. This is not my culture. So I'm not trying to change your culture, but I'm trying to understand your culture. What I want to understand is your culture, does it allow that women who are ill must die from their illnesses? They cannot, women doctors cannot work. They cannot see a male doctor. So what happens when they're on their deathbed and there's nobody to serve them? So I'm shocked to understand that your culture requires that women die." And he looked at me like I had committed blasphemy. And the reason was because there was something I didn't know, and that was that his mother was seriously ill, and he was trying to get her to Pakistan on an ICRC plane to see a doctor. So I didn't know that, but the other people, NGOs who were with me in the room, thought that I knew, and they were like, "Oh God, we're in trouble." And so I said, "So your children, your girls, your wife, your sister, your mother, your aunts can't see a doctor. And we have Afghan female doctors who are ready to work." He didn't give me an answer in the room. I walked out of the room, the NGOs were like, "We're going to be kicked out of here, Linda. You removed your scarf in front of him. You insulted him because you said he was allowing his mother to die and you knew his mother was ill." I didn't know. The next day, he lifted the edict, allowing female doctors to go to work, but they had to have their haram, a male relative, by their side. And the male relative could be their 2-year-old boy. As long as they had a male relative, they were allowed to work. So the hospital reopened. And I think what worked there was not that I didn't know that his mother was ill, but the fact that I said to him, "I'm not trying to change your culture. I'm trying to understand your culture. And what I understand is when women are sick, they die." And it kind of shocked him into really seeing the impact of the decision that he made, the impact it would have on him personally. So I always, again, respect the person I'm meeting with. I try to understand where they are coming from, but I am very aggressive in pushing the agenda that I've come to push, and I've used that throughout. I used it in negotiating with the president of Uganda, who had sign a bill that said gay people would die, gay people would be sentenced to death. And I'm looking at him, and he's like, "Linda, you're trying to impose your culture." And I'm like, "No, I'm not trying to impose our culture, but I don't understand a culture that says when people want to be who they are, you're going to kill them." And he lifted it. Now, he may go back. I don't know. May have gone back already. But it's, again, trying to get a point across without saying to the person, "You're evil, you're mean, what you're doing is awful." Because if we do that with our finger pointing, we come out of the room with nothing.
Thank you. Yes, standing up in the back.
Thank you very much. My name is Vladimir, I'm retired. So I have this question. I understand that the US Constitution calls for international treaties to be typically negotiated by the President and ratified by the Senate. And it seems like over the last several decades, a lot of important things are just, I guess, negotiated by the President or maybe foreign ministry, and never go to the Senate. Like a good example was Obama's agreement with Iran about nuclear non-proliferation, like maybe 10 years ago. So do you think this is a good flexibility, or vice versa, it is something which actually is bad because it makes such agreements less reliable?
I'm going to let you answer.
Yeah, I'm going to answer that one. So what has basically happened is that, I mean, a couple of things. First of all, according to the Constitution, any treaty has to be ratified by 2/3 of the Senate. Good luck trying to get 2/3 of the Senate at this point. The polarization within American parties is such that, you know, even the most anodyne treaties have difficulty getting that 2/3 vote. I still remember, I think it was the UNCLOS, the Law of the Sea Treaty, where like or I think it was it was the Treaty on Disabilities, where Bob Dole, who at this point was, you know, in a wheelchair, was like trucked out into the U.S. Senate to try to persuade his Republican colleagues to pass it, and it didn't happen. Now, what has happened as a result of that is that very often there are workarounds. Sometimes a lot of trade deals are not treaties, they're congressional executive agreements. That still requires the majority of the House and the Congress. That's also still a pretty hard lift at times. So increasingly, you're right. As Congress has become more and more, you know, dysfunctional. I mean, to be fair, there are times where Congress has valid reasons to oppose a treaty. But increasingly, if you're opposing it just for pure party line reasons, what you are seeing increasingly is what are so-called executive agreements, where it's just between the executive branch and whatever the counterpart is in another country. The thing about executive agreements is that they only last as long as the president wants them to last. So when Trump was elected the first time, you know, the Obama administration had the JCPOA, they had a deal with Cuba. The Paris Climate Change Accords, also a similar thing, all executive degrees. The Trump administration withdrew from all three of them, and he was perfectly within his legal rights to do so because they were just executive agreements. The other problem that we're learning, I think, is that it turns out that a lot of the rules-based international order wasn't based on rules, they were based on norms. In that a lot of the treaties that were passed by Congress that do have the status of hard law nonetheless have exit provisions that a president could exercise. And so even in the case where you do have treaties, you have the threat of exit. We're seeing this being talked about with NATO right now, for example. So one of the issues is that it's not just about the rules, it's not just about institutions, it's also about norms. And so if you have a president that has never met a norm he doesn't want to transgress, well, then you've got a problem because the executive agreements will only be around as long as that president is. And that goes back to what Ambassador Thomas Greenfield said, where, you know, other countries are asking the U.S. and the Biden team, how long can we count on your support? And their honest answer can only be up until January 1st, or January 20th of 2025. And by the way, that is also true of all the Trump administration agreements that they've signed, you know, basically now.
And this is a long-running issue,
yeah,
of course.
This long predates Trump.
And
yes.
it's not only the inability to negotiate formal treaties and get advice and consent to ratification by the Senate, it's also a trend of unsigning treaties that had Senate approval, which is used to be, well, the clauses are usually supreme national interest clauses, and those were seen as, you know, the break glass escape clauses, but those have been exercised in a variety of different ways and against the norm that had prevailed before. Yes, please.
I wanted to thank you both, all three of you, for the wonderful discussion we've had. My question, I'm a Hamilton Luger student, international law and Russian as well. I have a question about the U.S. in the UN and in the global order overall. As we've kind of been discussing today and yesterday, while the U.S. is isolating itself, it's perhaps sliding backwards in its democratic institutions. Europe and other countries around the world are amping up defense spending, perhaps trying to situate themselves in a position on the global stage to take over or replace the US. If the UN is reorganized, and this is a hypothetical, or is, you know, how did you put it, re-envisioned because it needs to be, because it's 80 years old, do you see the US remaining a leader in that area, or will there perhaps be a resorting of global leaders in terms of how the UN views them? Thank you.
This seems like a be careful what you ask for question.
Yeah. I don't think the UN can be successful without the United States being a part of it. And you'll notice that even though the Trump administration has withdrawn from a lot of the specialized UN agencies, they're never, I'm not hearing them say, we're going to withdraw from the United Nations. In fact, Ambassador Waltz, my predecessor, was recently in a speech, and while he was very critical of the UN and he talked about the fact we're not giving them money, he said, we're not going to withdraw, we just want to reform it. But the question is how they reform it, and they're not telling anyone what they want the UN to become. So I don't see the UN disappearing, although, as I said to someone the other day, I keep talking about wither the UN, but I also repeat constantly Secretary Albright's mantra that if we didn't have the UN, we would create it. Because it is the only place, even though there are all these little organizations and even we're creating our own UN or international organization to deal with Gaza, the only place in the world where 193 countries can come and sit at the table and have an opportunity to speak is in New York at the United Nations. And so people want it, we want it. I was just reading an article when I was on the plane that the Trump administration's threat to move out of the UN has New York up in arms because the UN is a key component of New York City financially. And if we didn't have the UN in New York City would probably collapse. So there's so much that the UN provides that people don't talk about, they don't realize, but I think they all know that the UN is important. But we're going to have to reform it. I am absolutely convinced that without reform, the UN will continue to fail. We need a UN that's proactive on political issues, that will send people out to negotiate, that will voice their concerns. I mean, when I look at the UN over the 4 years I was there, the UN didn't solve a single thing. They didn't go out and negotiate peace in Sudan. They didn't even try to deal with the situation in Haiti. They're good at humanitarian. Not perfect, but they're good at it, and we always want them there. UN peacekeeping forces stay too long. You know, there's no intention to send a peacekeeping force that's out there for 20 years. That's not keeping the peace. Look at Liberia. We actually ended one of the largest per capita peacekeeping forces in the world in Liberia because we built capacity in Liberia. We got the president and the UN and me. We called ourselves 3 women. We were the triumvirate. And we sat down and we decided it is time for this to go. And people were upset. Nobody wanted it to go because people had houses being rented by the thousands of UN people. Stores were being supported by 17,000 troops all over the country. And we were like, this is ridiculous. It's a country with 3 million people. We need to end this. And we ended it. So that's also something we have to work with the UN on. You're not to be there forever. You have to have an end point. Go in with goals, succeed or fail, but it's over after a point.
Speaking of endpoints, we are at our endpoint. Please, everyone, join me in thanking Dean Dresner, Ambassador Thomas Greenfield.
Thank you. Now I got to go read all your books.
Oh, please. Happy to send them to you.